she said. I need someone who makes me feel excited every single day, not just safe. I calmly agreed, helped her carry her bags outside, and closed the door forever. 8 months later, she sent me a message at 2 a.m. after finding out her new boyfriend had been lying about his job. You make me feel safe, Matthew, but I don't think you make me feel alive anymore. I set down my coffee cup. Slowly, the ceramic made a small sound against the granite countertop, and for a moment that sound was the only thing in the room. Victoria was standing near the window, arms crossed loosely over her chest, looking at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you've decided doesn't belong anymore. Not with anger, with something quieter than that, something that required less effort. I said, okay. She blinked. That wasn't the response she was expecting. I just think, she continued, that there's a difference between loving someone and being excited by them. And I need both. I nodded once. She kept talking after that. Something about growth and energy and what she deserved. The words moved past me like weather. I heard them without absorbing them. I was too busy noticing the small things. The way she'd already pushed her hair back before starting this conversation. The way her phone was face down on the kitchen table instead of in her pocket. Small things. The kind you file away without meaning to. What I didn't say that afternoon was that I'd been watching this coming for 3 months. Like watching a slow leak in the ceiling. You keep hoping it'll stop on its own. You keep not calling the contractor. What I also didn't say was that I already knew about Daniel. Not everything, but enough. At the time, I thought that was the worst thing she'd ever say to me. I was wrong. We had been engaged for 4 months. The ring had been sized twice, once when I bought it, once after she'd lost a little weight the summer before. The venue was booked. A restored farmhouse about 40 minutes outside the city, the kind with string lights and a gravel path and photos all over their website of couples laughing in golden hour light. We'd put down a deposit, not a small one. Her mother had already bought a dress. My mother had already started crying twice, once when I showed her the ring, once when we announced the date. We had a joint savings account with 11 months of combined contributions sitting in it. We had a lease that ran through March. We had a weekend bag in the back of the closet that had been packed for a trip to Portugal we were supposed to take in the fall. I thought about all of that while she talked. Not with panic. With the slow, heavy feeling of watching something expensive fall and knowing you can't catch it in time. After she finished her speech, and it was a speech, I realize now, rehearsed in the bathroom mirror or on her commute home, there was a silence that lasted about 15 seconds. I counted. Then she said, I think we should probably talk about the apartment. And I realized she'd already worked this out in her head. The conversation about feelings was the opening act. The conversation about logistics was the real one. She'd been practical about it. I'll give her that. We talked for another 20 minutes about who would keep what, how the lease would be handled, what to do about the venue deposit. She had a list on her phone. An actual list, organized by category. I answered every question in a level voice. She kept glancing at me like she was waiting for me to crack. I didn't. When the conversation ended, she went to the bedroom to make a phone call. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the coffee I hadn't finished. Then I washed the cup, dried it, and put it back in the cabinet. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I'm 31. I was 30 at the time. Victoria and I had been together for 3 years, engaged for 4 months of that. We met through mutual friends at someone's birthday dinner. One of those long restaurant tables where you end up talking to whoever's seated across from you. She was funny that night. Sharp. The kind of funny that requires actual intelligence. We lived together for the last 2 years of the relationship. The apartment was mine first. I'd had it for 2 years before she moved in. That detail will matter later. I worked in financial planning. Not glamorous, but stable. Good income, predictable hours. The kind of job that sounds boring at a party but pays for things without drama. I coached youth basketball on Tuesday evenings. I cooked most of our meals because I genuinely liked to cook and she genuinely didn't. Most people, if you asked them, would have described us as solid. I would have agreed. Looking back now, the first red flag wasn't a fight or a lie or even a moment of distance. It was something small and strange that I noticed about 8 months before the breakup and immediately explained away. We were at a dinner party. A friend of a friend's apartment, the kind of gathering where you don't know everyone, but you know enough people to be comfortable. At some point in the evening, I looked across the room and saw Victoria talking to a man I didn't recognize. Nothing suspicious in that. She was sociable. She talked to people. but there was something about her posture. Something switched on. A version of her I recognized from our early dates, fully present, slightly performing, the kind of energy you reserve for people you're trying to impress. She came back to me 20 minutes later and said she'd been talking to someone Andrew knows from work. I nodded and let it go. I wish I hadn't. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It happened in the way water erodes stone, slowly, without announcing itself, until one day you look and something has been worn away that used to be solid. The phone was the first thing I noticed. Victoria had always been on her phone. That wasn't new. But there's a difference between casual phone use and deliberate phone use. One is absent-minded. The other involves a certain quality of attention, a slight tilt away from you, a screen that dims and locks a half-second faster than normal. I noticed this in November. I told myself she was probably just deep in a work project. Then there were the comments. Small ones. Thrown out casually, almost as punctuation. Patrick just got promoted. His company actually rewards ambition, apparently. Andrew's girlfriend just got back from Lisbon. They go somewhere new every 2 months, she said. Did you see what Stephanie posted? She said her boyfriend surprised her with concert tickets on a Tuesday. Just because. None of these were directed at me. That was the thing. They were never phrased as criticism. Just observations. Held up to the light and turned over, like objects in a shop window. But they accumulated. The affection changed too. Not dramatically. She wasn't cold, wasn't cruel. But the texture of it shifted. Where there used to be easy, instinctive warmth, a hand on my arm, a head on my shoulder without thinking about it. Now there were gaps. Small delays. Moments where the gesture seemed to require a small decision instead of happening naturally. She stopped asking about my Tuesday basketball sessions. She used to ask, "How were the kids tonight? Anyone improve?" Small questions, but present. Then they stopped. I noticed the day she didn't ask, and I waited to see if she'd remember. She didn't. I let it go. There were moments when future plans came up, and she'd get a look on her face I couldn't fully read. Like she was calculating something. Like she was deciding whether to buy into a plan that might not apply to her for much longer. In December, I showed her a photo of a kitchen renovation I was considering. Something small, new countertops, different fixtures. I'd been thinking about it for months. She looked at the photo for a second and said, "Sure, whatever you want." 6 months earlier, she would have had opinions. Specific ones. One evening in late January, I came home to find her on the couch with her phone angled away from me in a way that felt practiced. When she looked up, there was a half-second of adjustment, a small resetting, before her expression settled. I sat down on the other end of the couch. She said, "Good day?" I said, "Fine." We watched television for 2 hours without really talking. I didn't say anything about what I'd noticed. I still don't know entirely why not. Maybe I was hoping I was wrong. Maybe I was buying time. Maybe I already knew what the conversation would cost, and I wasn't ready to pay it. That evening ended without incident. That was somehow worse. It was a Wednesday in February, and it started as a conversation about dinner. I'd made pasta. Something I'd made a dozen times. Nothing special, just the kind of reliable midweek meal that a relationship accumulates. She sat across from me and pushed her food around for a few minutes before she said, almost casually, "I ran into Daniel today." I kept eating. "He's doing really well, apparently. Just got back from Tokyo. Work trip, but he stayed an extra week." "Good for him," I said. She looked at me like she was expecting something else. He asked how things were going. "With us." "What did you tell him?" She paused. I said, "Fine." There was something in that pause. I said, "How do you know Daniel?" "I've mentioned him. He was at Andrew's thing in October." She had not mentioned him. I knew she hadn't because I remembered the dinner party, the man I didn't recognize, the switched-on posture. I didn't say that. Instead, I said, "I don't think you've mentioned him." "I'm sure I have." Easy. Unbothered. The tone of someone who knows they can't be proven wrong. We finished dinner mostly in silence. Later, clearing the dishes, she said, "He's starting his own company. Something in tech consulting. He seems really driven." I nodded. "His stories are just, he has a lot going on." I said, She looked at me again. Waiting. I stacked the plates in the dishwasher and didn't give her what she was looking for. She went to bed early that night. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, running the conversation back through my head. Not because I was angry, because something about it felt structured. Like the information had been delivered in a specific order for a specific reason. I've worked in finance long enough to recognize when someone is building toward a pitch. I didn't know what the pitch was yet, but I knew I was being prepared for something. That should have been my warning. It happened on a Saturday. The weather was the kind of flat, gray February weather that offers nothing. Not dramatic enough to be memorable, just quietly miserable. I had been up since 7. She had slept in. When she came into the kitchen around 10, she was already dressed. Not in the loose, comfortable way of a weekend morning. Dressed with intention. I poured her coffee without being asked. She sat down and wrapped both hands around the mug and didn't say anything for a while. I knew. I stood at the counter with my own coffee and waited. "Matthew," she said. "Yeah. I've been thinking a lot." "I know." She looked up. "You know?" "I know you've been thinking," I said. "What have you decided?" That disrupted her a little. The speech, whatever version she'd rehearsed, required a different first act. She recalibrated. "I think I've been unhappy for a while. And I don't think it's your fault. You're a good person. You're steady, reliable. The compliments that are really insults. But I need someone who makes me feel excited every single day, not just safe." She said this looking at her coffee. "I need to feel like I'm living, Matthew. Not just settled." I said, "Okay. That's it. Okay. What would you like me to say?" "I don't know. Something. Anything." I thought about that. About what she was actually asking for. She wanted a reaction, not necessarily to change her mind, but to validate that the decision was large enough to warrant one. That what she was walking away from was worth something. A reaction would have confirmed her importance to this story. I wasn't willing to give her that. "Victoria," I said, "if you need to go, then go. You're not even going to fight for this." "No. Why not?" I looked at her for a moment. "Because fighting implies I think you're making a mistake. And I think you've already decided, and I think somewhere in you, you've been decided for a while. So no, I'm not going to perform a scene that might make you feel better about leaving." She didn't have an answer for that. There was a long silence. Then she said, quietly, "I'm going to stay at Stephanie's for a while." "Okay," I said. "Do you want help with your bags?" She stared at me. "You're going to help me pack?" "You have that rolling suitcase with the broken wheel. The big one. It's easier with 2 people." Something crossed her face that I still think about. Not quite sadness. Something more complicated. The expression of someone who expected resistance and received only a door held open. We packed 2 bags together in near silence. She had apparently already figured out what she needed for a first trip. Clothes, toiletries, her laptop, the small framed photo from her nightstand. The photo was of the 2 of us in Maine, the summer before last. I noticed she took it. I didn't comment. I carried the large bag to the door. She stood in the hallway and looked at me. "I didn't want it to be like this," she said. "Like what?" "So quiet." "Would louder have been better?" She didn't answer. I held the door open and she walked through it. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her pull the suitcase toward the elevator, and then I stepped back inside and closed the door. No slam. No speech. No last look. Just the click of the latch. The first post appeared 4 days later. It was one of those vague, poetic things, a screenshot of a quote over a blurred landscape photo. Something about choosing aliveness over comfort and the courage it takes to start over. She'd captioned it with 3 words, "New season beginning." I didn't react. I didn't comment. I kept scrolling. Within 24 hours, the post had 43 likes. Several from friends I recognized. A few comments offering support. "You deserve everything. And so proud of you. And the inevitable your energy has been different lately. This makes sense." I've always found it interesting how readily people assign heroism to the person who leaves. Our mutual friend Rebecca texted me the next morning. Just, "Hey, you doing okay?" I replied, "Yeah, thanks for checking in." She called me that evening. I let it ring twice, then answered. "I saw her post," Rebecca said carefully. "I saw it too." She made it sound like, I don't know, like she'd been suffocating. I didn't say anything. She told me you barely reacted. When she left, she said it was almost like you didn't care. "I cared," I said. "I just didn't think a scene would help anyone." Rebecca was quiet for a second. She also said you'd been distant. Checked out. That you stopped making her feel special a long time ago. I let that land. "That's a version of events," I said. "Matthew, I'm not asking you to defend me. Rebecca, I'm not asking anyone to. She can say what she needs to say." There was a silence. Then, "You know about Daniel, don't you?" It wasn't really a question. "I know something," I said. She says it's nothing. That nothing happened while you were together. "Maybe," I said. "You don't believe her." "I don't need to," I said. "It doesn't change anything that matters now." Rebecca sighed quietly. "You're handling this very strangely, Matthew. How would you like me to handle it?" "I don't know. Normal people fall apart. I'll get back to you on that," I said, and we both almost laughed. The posts continued over the following 2 weeks. More quotes. A gym check-in. A Sunday brunch photo with Stephanie that carefully didn't mention why brunch with Stephanie had become a regular event. An indirect caption about people who drain your energy without realizing it that 3 of our mutual friends liked without apparently considering who it might refer to. I stayed quiet. I unmuted nothing. I blocked no one. I posted nothing in return. The silence, I sensed, frustrated people more than any response would have. That wasn't even the strangest part. March arrived, and I rebuilt my life the way you rebuild anything, by showing up every day without drama. The apartment was mine, so that wasn't the issue. I rearranged 2 pieces of furniture and repainted the bedroom a shade darker. Something I'd wanted to do for over a year and never done because we hadn't agreed on the color. The new color was perfect. I threw myself into work. Not desperately, not in the way of someone trying to outrun their own thoughts, but with genuine focus. A project I'd been cautious about for months, I agreed to take on in full. My manager noticed within 3 weeks. By April, I was being considered for a senior position that hadn't existed before. I kept the Tuesday basketball sessions. The kids were 12 and 13. They didn't care about my personal life. They cared whether I was going to run the full court drill or let them scrimmage. I ran the drill. They complained. I didn't care. They got better. I started cooking more seriously. Not as an act of self-improvement, more as something that required just enough attention to be meditative. A friend of mine, Patrick, came over for dinner one evening in March and said, "This is genuinely the best thing I've eaten in months," and I realized I had needed to hear that. Patrick was a good friend. He'd known us both. He asked about Victoria exactly once. I answered briefly, and he never brought her up again unless I did. That kind of friendship is rarer than it should be. I slept better than I expected. There were hard nights. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The first Saturday morning, without her specific quality of silence in the apartment, was strange. The absence of someone isn't just about missing them. It's about the restructuring of all your small habits. The routines you didn't know were collaborative, but the hard nights were manageable. And in their place, something quieter moved in. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but space. The particular kind of peace that comes when you stop bracing for something. Meanwhile, fragments reached me without my searching. Stephanie, who remained, to her credit, genuinely neutral, mentioned once, not unkindly, that Victoria seemed really happy with Daniel. That they'd been to a rooftop event and a private gallery opening and a weekend trip to Charleston. She said this the way you say something when you're watching for the reaction it produces. I said, "That's good. I hope she is." Stephanie paused slightly too long before responding. I didn't know what that pause meant yet. The second time I encountered Daniel was at Rebecca's birthday in May. I hadn't known he would be there. Probably no one thought to mention it, or probably everyone assumed someone else would. Either way, I walked into Rebecca's apartment, saw a group of people near the kitchen, and recognized the back of his head before he turned around. He was tall, good-looking in the effortful way of men who track their appearance carefully, well-dressed, the kind of person who enters a room at a particular volume. We didn't speak directly for most of the evening, which was fine by me. But at some point, near the end of the night, we ended up near each other at the drinks table. The conversation was brief and surface level, polite in the way of 2 people who understand their context. He was charming, easy with words. I noticed he spoke about himself almost entirely in the future tense. What the company was going to be, what the Tokyo deal was going to lead to, what the next 18 months were going to look like. I've worked in finance long enough to know that people who live primarily in the future tense are often managing a distance from the present. I filed that away. What was stranger was a conversation I had later that evening with a man named Marcus, someone I knew vaguely, a friend of Andrew's who worked in some kind of business development. We were talking about something unrelated when he mentioned, completely offhand, that he'd heard of Daniel's consulting firm. "Oh yeah," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Yeah, I actually looked them up a while back. Thought there might be a connection." He paused. "Couldn't find much. Website's pretty thin. Like, no client list, no case studies, just a splash page really." "New company," I said. "I guess." He tilted his drink slightly. "But he's been talking about it for at least 2 years. You'd think there'd be something by now." He moved on to another conversation a moment later. I stood there for a moment, looking across the room to where Daniel was making someone laugh. Something felt off. I didn't say anything. That should have been my warning to pay closer attention. I wasn't looking for information. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't running searches or calling people or engineering conversations. I wasn't that person. But when information arrives uninvited, you notice it, especially when it arrives more than once. The Tokyo trip came up again in June, through a completely different channel. An acquaintance mentioned they'd seen Daniel at an industry event around the same week he'd supposedly been in Japan. I didn't confirm this or challenge it. I just noted it. The consulting firm had a LinkedIn page. 62 followers. No employees listed beyond Daniel himself. The company had been incorporated. I verified this easily enough. It's public record. But the registered address was a mail forwarding service in Midtown. That's not necessarily suspicious on its own. Plenty of small, legitimate operations use forwarding addresses. But there was more. At a coffee with Rebecca in July, she mentioned that Daniel had told Victoria he was negotiating a significant acquisition deal, something that would, according to him, set them up for a level of financial stability that made their current lifestyle look like the preview. Victoria, Rebecca said, had been telling people about this deal. I asked when it was supposed to close. Rebecca said, he keeps pushing the date back. First it was March, then June, now apparently it's fall. I nodded and changed the subject. Patrick texted me a week later. Random question. Did Victoria ever mention what kind of clients Daniel's firm works with? I replied, she mentioned tech consulting. Why? He wrote back, someone I know from a previous job says they met him at a conference 2 years ago. He was pitching himself as a venture capitalist then. Different story entirely. I put my phone down. I thought about Victoria standing in our kitchen in February, her hands around a coffee mug, telling me about Tokyo and drive and aliveness. I thought about the man she'd chosen instead of safety. I thought about how often the thing that feels like freedom is just a different kind of cage. The dots were there to connect. I wasn't the one connecting them. She was. It was a Thursday in late October. I'd been asleep for about 2 hours when my phone lit up on the nightstand. I registered the light without fully waking, rolled over, told myself it was nothing, and was almost back under when something made me pick it up. 2:07 a.m. The name on the screen was Victoria. I sat up. I hadn't heard from her in roughly 4 months. Not since a brief, logistical email in July about the last of some shared belongings. Before that, silence, complete and apparently mutual. I looked at the notification for a moment before opening it. The message was 8 words. I think Daniel lied about everything. I'm scared. I read it twice. Not, I made a mistake. Not, I'm sorry. Not even, I need to talk. Just, I think Daniel lied about everything. I'm scared. I set the phone down on the bed beside me and sat in the dark for a while. I wasn't angry. I noticed this about myself with something like detachment. 8 months earlier, a message like that might have pulled me in a dozen different directions. Now it just landed. Without drama. I was 31 years old. I had been awake for 2 hours and was now fully awake. And the woman who had told me she needed someone who made her feel alive was texting me at 2 a.m. from whatever situation she'd found for herself. I looked at the phone again. I turned it face down on the nightstand and lay back. I didn't reply that night. I waited 3 days. Not to punish her. Not to play a game. Because I genuinely needed to think about whether I wanted to open this door at all and what I would do with whatever was on the other side of it. On the 3rd day I texted, "Are you okay? Are you safe?" She replied within 2 minutes. Physically, yes. Otherwise, I don't know. What followed was a series of conversations over 2 weeks. Text at first, then 1 phone call, then a conversation over coffee at a place that was neutral to both of us. The truth came out the way ice melts. Not in one dramatic pour. Slowly, at the edges first, then from the center. The company was real in the legal sense. It existed on paper, but it had no active revenue. Daniel had been sustaining his lifestyle through a combination of a remaining inheritance that was nearly exhausted, a personal loan from a college friend who had started asking for repayment, and a credit situation he'd kept entirely hidden from Victoria. The Tokyo trip had been real. The purpose of it had not. He'd told her it was a client meeting. It was, according to a woman Victoria had eventually spoken to, a failed attempt to pitch a startup that had already passed on him twice before. The acquisition deal, the one that kept getting pushed back, did not exist in any form Victoria could verify. When she'd finally pushed him on specifics, the story had changed 3 times in one conversation. The gallery openings and the rooftop events and the Charleston weekend had all gone on a credit card that was now carrying a balance she hadn't known about until she found a statement he'd left in his car. I asked him about it. She told me over coffee, her hands around a mug in a way that reminded me painfully of that February morning. He said it was a temporary thing, a cash flow issue. That the deal would fix everything. What did you say? I said I needed to see something real. Something I could actually verify. She paused. He got angry. Not violently, but angry in the way of someone who isn't used to being questioned. I nodded. And then I started actually looking, she said. Really looking. And things just didn't add up. The timeline of when he started the company. The clients he mentioned by name, but never had any documented history with. The way his friends talked about his work when he wasn't in the room versus when he was. What did his friends say when he wasn't in the room? She looked at her coffee. They changed the subject. I thought about Marcus at Rebecca's birthday party. Couldn't find much. Website's pretty thin. Rebecca told me some of this was visible earlier, I said carefully. Victoria nodded slowly. I know. And you? I know, Matthew. Silence. I wanted it to be what he said it was, she said quietly. I wanted the aliveness to be real. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, aliveness and performance are very different things, and most people can't tell them apart at a distance. I just said, I understand. Do you? More than you might think. Another silence. She reached into her bag and set her phone on the table between us. A screenshot. It was a message from Daniel to someone else. I didn't ask who. Describing Victoria in terms I won't repeat here. The message was about 6 weeks old. It treated her with a particular kind of carelessness that made it obvious she had never been the main story in his. I looked at it for a moment and then looked away. I'm sorry, I said. And I meant it. Why are you sorry? You weren't the one who. I know. I'm just sorry you had to find this out this way. She was quiet for a long time after that. We talked once more after that coffee. She'd called on a Sunday afternoon, and I'd answered, and we talked for a long time about things that mattered and things that didn't. It was easier than I expected. The sharpness was gone. In its place was something that felt closer to honest conversation between two people who no longer had anything to prove to each other. At some point she said, I've been thinking about what I said. When I left, the thing about excitement versus safety. I remember. I said it like safety was a consolation prize. You did. I was wrong about that. I didn't tell her she was right. I didn't tell her I'd always known she'd come to that conclusion eventually, or that I'd held on to it like a private vindication. I didn't have a prepared speech. I'd spent 8 months not preparing for this conversation, and that turned out to be the right choice. I was also wrong about Daniel, she said. Obviously, you were misled. I helped mislead myself. I respected that. The ability to hold your own responsibility without deflecting it entirely. Yes, I said. A little. Are you doing well? She asked. Actually well, not just saying it. Actually well. She exhaled quietly. I can tell. You sound different. Different how? Like someone who knows where they stand. I thought about that. About the apartment repainted in the right color. About the promotion that had come through in July. About Tuesday evenings with 12-year-olds who were shooting noticeably better than they had in March. About the particular quality of a life that fits. Yeah, I said. I think that's accurate. I'm glad, she said. And her voice was steady when she said it, which meant she was telling the truth. I hope things settle for you, I said. Thank you. Take care of yourself, Victoria. You too, Matthew. There was nothing more after that. No dramatic reversal. No offer from her. No refusal from me. No closing argument that rewrote everything that had come before. Just a phone call that ended with both people at peace, which is rarer than it should be. I sat quietly after I hung up. The apartment was still. Outside, October was doing what it does, pulling the light early, turning everything a little sharper and a little cooler. I sat with it for a while. Then I made dinner. The venue deposit was partially refunded after some back and forth. Enough to matter. Victoria, I heard through Rebecca eventually, moved into her own place in November. She and Daniel had ended in September, quietly, from what I understood, without a scene. She took a work trip in the spring and came back seeming steadier than before. Rebecca said she seemed more like herself. Daniel, as far as I know, is still describing the same acquisition deal to whoever will listen. The close date has moved to next spring. Patrick was promoted in November. He brought a bottle of wine to my apartment to celebrate something neither of us fully explained, and we stayed up late and talked about basketball and work and what the next few years might reasonably look like. It was one of the better evenings I can remember. My senior position came with a team of 4. I started that in August. It required more of me than I expected and gave more back than I anticipated. I did not reply to the 2 a.m. message the night it arrived. I've thought about that choice more than once since then, whether it was cold, whether it was right, whether kindness would have looked different. But I think what I understood in that moment lying in the dark with a lit phone screen beside me, was that she didn't need me at 2 in the morning. She needed the truth at 2 in the morning. And the truth was something only she could find. I wasn't the door she needed to walk back through. I was the door she'd already closed. She'd done that. I just held it open.